So I actually did a Sansa reread coming into this podcast because I like her character, and I'm so aware that most people don't. And the person I discussed her with most from the forums is Erinese, aka Nadine. And she comes down on the Arya side of the debate, and I come down on the Sansa side of the debate. And the reason is that I think Arya is the character most of us think we would like to be because she's so feisty and awesome. But in reality, I think a lot of us girls at that age would probably end up being like Sansa. And I think she has a kind of an interesting character arc, not as obviously interesting as Jaime or Cersei, but still quite interesting. Because when we first meet her in Game of Thrones, she's kind of a bit of a social snob. She's quite conformist. She's a romantic with a capital R, so she believes all that stuff about chivalry and knights and stuff. And, you know, she's quite unlikable insofar as she treats Jon with disdain. And she's quite self-absorbed. She snitches on her dad, which is pretty nasty with dire consequences. And she barely identifies as a Stark, which I think is quite interesting for what happens later. But then, you know, I always thought when I read Game of Thrones that, you know, when you're 11 or 12 as a young girl and you're the good girl and you're the conformist, that's kind of what you do. I found it really realistic, and it probably says something quite tragic about what I was like at that age. And she also does show some signs of empathy. So, for instance, when Sir Barristan is stripped of his cloak, she's really sympathetic towards him. You know, by the end of the book, she's pretty clear about what Joffrey's done to her, and she's pretty wide awake. And then as we move into Clash of Kings, I think it's kind of interesting because the first part of the book, when you read it closely, she's kind of quite depressed and almost near suicidal. And there's this one point where the Hound nearly kind of has to pull her back from the ledge, and really, you know, at a low point. But as the book goes forward, I think she becomes increasingly sympathetic, partly in relationship to the Hound. So she has great empathy towards him. He, of course, saves her from the crowd. She becomes a lot more self-aware. She still has that romanticism, and she's still, in a way, a bit of a victim and trying to find someone to save her. So she's still clinging to the old ideals. But, of course, that all basically ends by the end of the book. And as we get to Storm of Swords, she has a lot of chapters, and they're really important chapters. She's our POV through a lot of very big scenes. And to me, this is Sansa Stark's big coming of age book. So she starts identifying as a Stark. She talks a lot about being brave like Robb, and, you know, gathering strength from and pride from the fact that she comes from that family. She still has this kind of residual romanticism, but she's much more kind of scornful of the foolish little child that she once was. And when she meets the Tyrell girls, for instance, she's like, oh, well, they're all very nice and lovely, but they're the kind of giggling little schoolgirls that I once used to be. And she becomes quite cynical, you know, about the fact that she's only being wooed because of her claim to Winterfell. But, you know, I think for me, and I guess what people mostly criticize about Sansa is that she's just a victim and she's so apathetic. But I think we have kind of two really interesting points of action in this book, which sets us up for Feast for Crows. And the first is that, you know, on her wedding night with Tyrion, he tries to do the nice thing, which is I won't force myself on you. But I think he still thinks that at some point he is going to, like, deflower her. And she kind of uses this one chink of mercy from him to say, and what if I never want you to sleep with me? So she has the courage to take what's this kind of almost offhand act of kindness and parlay it into something much more meaningful. And I think that's kind of a really big act of bravery. And then as we move to the end of Storm of Swords, where, you know, she's been through the Purple Wedding and she's managed her escape with Littlefinger and she ends up in the Eyrie, she suddenly thinks to herself, you know what, I don't want to marry Robert. I don't want to be, Sweet Robin. I don't want to be married again. And I'm going to tell Lyssa that. So I think that in a way she has a kind of journey that's a little bit similar to Cersei coming into Feast for Crows, where she's suddenly realizing that I don't particularly want to be just bandied around as someone to be married off for my claim. I want to be, you know, taking some action for my life. But I'll be interested to see if you guys all agree with me that that's really what's going on, because maybe I'm reading onto her some more active role that she doesn't necessarily have. And so that's kind of a long preamble to get us to Feast for Crows, where she only has 3 POV chapters, and she's in the Eyrie and she's with Littlefinger, And in a way, her chapters are kind of just a way for us to really see revealed the plotting that Littlefinger has done. So we don't necessarily get as much about her. But what's interesting is we're seeing her becoming Elaine, his bastard daughter, apparently, and almost a kind of split personality. It's not as kind of grave as Theon Reek, but it's definitely there. So when the book opens, she's very conflicted about her relationship with Peter. She thinks Peter is kind and is trying to do the best for her, but she also recognizes that Littlefinger did absolutely nothing for her in King's Landing and is really, really sort of sly and cunning, and is someone to be watchful for. She's very smart. Like, how Jaime becomes wiser and smarter in the novels? I feel Sansa does that. So she figures out how the hairnet worked at the end of Storm of Swords. She figures out how Littlefinger is making Lord Nestor his ally. And, that I think is kind of interesting. As we go into Sansa 2, she's obviously decided to throw her lot in with Littlefinger, or that she has no other choice, that her family's all dead. What other choice does she have? So I think it is significant that George R. R. Martin calls that Elaine 1. And it's kind of interesting linguistically when you read it really closely. She starts referring to Littlefinger and herself as we and their common aims. So that's the chapter in which the Lords Declarant come to the Eyrie. And you just see her observing how clever Littlefinger is at making them give him another year in charge. And, she says to him, I must know how you're going to split them up over the next year. So I love the fact that she's starting to take control and she wants to learn. She's realized that she can't avoid being in the Game of Thrones. So she'd rather be a player than a piece. And who better to learn from than Littlefinger? So I love that kind of getting to grips with her destiny. And then in the final chapter again, which is another Elaine chapter rather than Sansa chapter, you realize that she's becoming incredibly complicit with Littlefinger. And I think something for us to discuss is how complicit is she in his plans and what are they? So the whole point of this chapter is they're trying to get Robin down from the Eyrie because it's basically under siege, and that he's having his shaking fits. And there's this whole discussion with Maester Coleman about, are they allowed to give him more sweet sleep, which is this potentially quite toxic drug that calms him down but could ultimately kill him? And the question is that she explicitly says to the Maester to give Robin some more of this drug, and how far does she know what that's doing? And then I think another interesting thing about this kind of chapter of the descent from the Eyrie is she has this conversation with Lady Miranda Royce, who's this quite kind of sexually confident woman. And, this is the Sansa who was such a prim and proper lady, and they're joking about how this one guy died between the legs of this other guy and of this woman, and how, is Littlefinger, does he really have a small dick? And it's just like, you just cannot believe that Sansa is having this conversation willingly, but she's doing it as Elaine. And she always says, she's aged up Elaine. Elaine's a year older than her. And she says, I'm not, to be afraid descending this mountain is something that Sansa would do. Elaine is going to be confident. So it's just a total, and she's talking about, do you think Lothar, fancies Maya when she's dressed in leathers, or does he want her to be dressed up as a woman? Like, really quite kind of bawdy stuff. And then, of course, again, all the way through these last 2 chapters, you've had her misremembering this kiss with the Hound. So she's obviously becoming far more sort of sexually aware, and is focusing this attention to date on the Hound, which I find, I'm a big Sansa shipper, so that's all good for me. So as we leave Sansa in Feast for Crows, I think she's adopted this really active personality of a bastard. And bear in mind, like, how snobbish she was towards Jon. So this is like a huge turnaround anyway. She's sexually awakened, definitely, and aware of how much Littlefinger is sleazing all over her. And I wonder if she's going to exploit that. And then she's had this arranged marriage done for her with Harry the Heir, who potentially inherits the Vale. And she already inherits Winterfell, so that makes her very powerful. And I guess the question is just, why on earth would Littlefinger arrange this marriage for her? What has he got planned? So I think Sansa's interesting. I think Feast for Crows is the first book where she's really taking control of her destiny and doing stuff she would never do at Sansa, even if she has to adopt the personality of Elaine to kind of justify to herself getting it done. So there you go. That's my kind of summary. And I guess my questions for all of you are, in general with Sansa, are there going to be consequences from Lady being killed? Is she a candidate for the beautiful queen that Cersei fears? Does she believe don't you find it weird that when Littlefinger says, and by the way, I took your mother's virginity, she doesn't really have much of a reaction to that? And how complicit is she in Sweet Robin's poisoning? And what's Peter's plan? So lots of questions to ask about her, I think.
She hears about Jon Snow being Lord Commander, and she says that she feels an attachment to Jon, and she feels like she would like to see him again.
Yeah, but it's weird, isn't it? Because all the way through, up until that point, whenever she said, I'm totally alone, like she has a dream of Winterfell and she dreams of her brothers, she never dreams of Jon. Like in her mind, up until that point, he's just not part of her family. And it's only when even when she's like adopting the kind of persona of the bastard or told to do that, she doesn't immediately think of him, which I find weird. Like, wouldn't you think of the one bastard that you knew? And it's only kind of as a last minute thought. And even when she does it, she is quite wistful and says, oh, well, I guess I'll never see him because Elaine has no bastards. It's the first time she's thought of him in 4 books, and it doesn't last long. I just wanted to ask each of you, I guess, are you people who found Sansa irritating and annoying and passive, or are you secret fans of Sansa as well?
No, I'm a huge fan of Sansa. However, not because I find Sansa that interesting, but I feel that she's always surrounded by interesting people.
Yeah,
I love the small council scenes. She shares chapters with Tyrion, Cersei, small council, the Tyrells. So I think that she's just always surrounded by very interesting characters that I like to hear about. But I still do root for Sansa and her story, but I'm not sure if I find her on her own that interesting.
Yeah, I feel really the same with you, Glenn, on that. I think that she was very interesting to read, mostly because of her interactions with this wide tableau of characters that we see in King's Landing. And I guess the issue is that we reasonably, because she has a lot of these moments that you can reasonably understand that she is continually having her trust in various things broken and then finding something else that she might be willing to believe in. And that is broken, and eventually we end up in this place where she ends up in the Vale with Littlefinger, where she is completely disenfranchised from all of that. She has broken all of those willingness to trust anybody. But as a result, that she is now sort of alone in the Vale, we lose a lot of that fun interaction. So while Sansa has changed to become a more interesting and more developed character because of what she's gone through, and the time it took was reasonable again. But now that she's alone, it's just not interesting yet to see how this new Sansa is, because we don't have a ton of people for her to play off of.
Although I feel that she always is present when interesting, even in the Vale, she manages to be present and kind of provoke Lysa Arryn to reveal everything about the machinations from Game of Thrones. I mean, Littlefinger just seems to have this like willingness to tell her stuff, so I feel that even though she's away from the small council and the Lannisters, she's always going to be around interesting information. And at some point, presumably in the next book, Peter's going to make some pretty bold moves. So I guess she's going to come back to the action a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're setting up for a very interesting Sansa to come. All right.
And I also just feel a character like Sansa, she's almost like halfway through perhaps an interesting arc, and she just cannot have heard that much interesting stuff and been around so many interesting, good players of the game without learning so much. And I feel ultimately, I wonder if she's going to end up as one of the real victors in this game, because her apprenticeship is so fantastic. She reminds me of a sort of Daniel Radcliffe who learnt how to act by working in Harry Potter with the cream of British acting talent. You know, she's just had she starts off as this kind of like completely conventional, rather boring little girl, but she's got to end up being fantastic, hasn't she?
That's good.
That's interesting. I've always found Sansa to be the weakest of the Stark kids, maybe slightly above Rickon or something. And now the 3 Stark kids are undergoing their training, right? Bran is becoming a third, the Raven, and Arya is going to become a faceless man, and now Sansa is undergoing her training under Peter, and but where Bran and Arya showed talents before they met their mentors, Sansa never showed much talent before she met or before Peter took her in. So I'm like, so I'm not too. I have doubts about her.
Oh,
But
you
but
see, I would
your
disagree. I disagree. I think she did show talent. I think that in King's Landing, the fact that she was able to always be courteous, to never let slip that facade, to never give the little, the little spies anything to hear from her. But actually, when you read it back again and you realize there are so many occasions on which she does, Joffrey's a freaking psychopath. And she does
no
have the
no no.
ability to kind of influence him for the better. So to not kill Dontos, to mollify the crowds, when they're going through King's Landing. She has an amazing. I think she has a good EQ. Like she's very empathetic, and she does manage to, within the small capacity that she has, to exert influence. And whenever someone does give her a chance to make a decision, which is very rare, like Tyrion, she gets an absolutely brilliant result. Like, she keeps her maidenhead. She doesn't sleep with a monstrous imp, right?
You're absolutely right. Now that you started listing each one of the things she's done, they're all very subtle. Like probably a hand in poisoning Robin, showing her maturity, not falling for Harry the Hare, or yeah. Now that you list all these small minor things, they all add up, and I can definitely see that she is in the league with Bran and Arya, and not inferior, I don't have doubts about her now as much as I
I think
did.
it's just a slower development. And of course she's not off there like, killing people and whatnot, but I just find it more plausible. I mean, bear in mind, she starts the books at 11, 12 and ends up at 13, 14. So even in the aged up world that we have, where, it's a world in which people do more younger, I still think, I just find her far more credible than the Arya story.
And when you talk about if she'll soon become one of the victors in this Game of Thrones they're playing, the self-control that she has shown and this sense of this lady's armor and her almost political acumen that she's developing and will clearly develop further as she deals more with Littlefinger, I think that she is showing a lot of talent and a lot of potential to possibly come out ahead, because as of right now, I don't see her developing the kind of weaknesses that other players have, like Cersei with her lack of self-control, with her anger, and Littlefinger potentially with his weakness being Sansa or Caitlyn or those sort of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing about Sansa is that she's just intelligent, right? She's book smart. So she does, as soon as she sees the murder of Joffrey, she figures out it's the Hairnet. She keeps up with the ancestry of Harold the Heir, right? I mean, that long, boring thing when Peter Baelish is talking about who he is, and we're like, huh? What? Who? And she's like, oh my God, so he's Sweet Robin's heir. That's amazing. You're just like, what? So you have to give her some credit there. And I think there are a couple of times, and Peter's not stupid, but there are a couple of times when he says, it's clever of you to have figured that out, to have jumped ahead of me and figured that out. And I think George is giving us a clear signal that she's bright. And if you compare her to the other Stark kids, we've never seen Arya have to be tested kind of for pure sort of abstract reasoning in a way, and certainly not Bran. But Jon, when he has to rule, I mean, I would argue that, okay, he's got bigger shit to deal with, right? So it's a hard comparison, but I don't think Sansa does too badly. And I just think anyone who's survived King's Landing and survived the Eyrie with this kind of mad woman Lyssa and Marillion, the rapist, I mean, she's not doing too badly.
Absolutely. I think that, like I say, Sansa is going to have a very interesting arc to come. I have a hard time reading, especially the interaction she has with like Sweet Robin, because I just find his character so detestable. And that's just a personal qualm on my part. It doesn't speak to the writing or any of that. I think that, again, Sansa will be an incredibly interesting character. She already is one, and it's just my personal qualms that make it difficult for me to read some of those chapters.
So I guess a question I would have is, what do you guys think is her level of knowledge about, or okay, two parts. What do you think Peter's really up to with Sweet Robin and Harry the Heir? And how much do you think Sansa's really complicit at this stage, or maybe will become complicit in the next book?
Peter definitely went through a lot of trouble arranging her match with Harry the Hare. He had to give Lady Anya a huge dowry, for letting her do this. And it's up to Sansa now to actually win Harry the Hare's hand. Lady Anya said that she was not going to force him to marry Sansa, and so it's now up to Sansa to romance him and win over him. So I think that's going to be a good test of how much has she progressed. Maybe Peter sees himself as the next Tywin Lannister, now that Tywin Lannister's gone, and he's gonna play Sansa like Tywin played Cersei, and gather up the north, gather up the east.
One thing I think you have to keep in mind is that Peter is not in a good spot right now. He is the Lords of the Vale gathering at the bottom of the Vale in the valley, and he's not in a safe place. He needs Sansa, I think, to make all of this work, and I think that adds a level of complicity to their relationship on both sides, because I also think Sansa needs Littlefinger to get out of this spot and to progress further and possibly get home to Winterfell.
And I wonder
so
how
I do think they're complicit.
She always talks about her claim as something irritating, that, the Queen of Thorns is only talking to me and interested in me because of my claim or whatever. Or Lyssa only wants me to marry Robin because of my claim. To date, she has never herself said, I want to assert my right to Winterfell. And I think it would be interesting if we ever got to that point. Because if Sansa were really ambitious, what she would do is woo Harold, which is not, unlikely. It's not unlikely to succeed because she's really pretty and he's basically got a constant hard-on, so that would work. She would marry him, get pregnant, have a kid by him, then murder Robin, because then his ascension is secure, but her position within that is secure because she has his heir. And then at a convenient time a few years later, if Peter's still on the scene, well, at that point she reveals herself to be Sansa Stark, gathers up the Lords and Knights of the Vale and goes and gets Winterfell. And then depending on how far Peter really has groomed her, she either gets rid of Peter and says, I don't need you anymore because now I have like half the kingdom. Or if she really is still groomed by Peter, they then kind of conveniently kill off Harold and he remarries her. Bish bash bosh, she owns half the kingdom. Plus, he's presumably got shitloads of money still.
Talking about that, and you mentioned this in your recap, do you think that Sansa is going to become the next Cersei? Do you think that there's a distinction between them? Do you think that the cynicism and the jaded feeling she's developed is just a natural result of her being in King's Landing, or is there something more to that?
Oh, no, I think she's far superior to Cersei. I just think the only similarity...
Yeah, I think so.
The only similarity with Cersei is they're both women who have started off with romantic ideals, perhaps. Sansa certainly more than Cersei, but both of them a little bit. And have been married once and been made quite cynical by that process of being bartered. And then when it comes to the realization it's about to happen again, get a bit radical and revolutionary about it. And with Sansa, it's happening at a younger age. And she makes a positive decision. I don't want to marry Sweet Robin, and I'm going to tell my aunt. And we don't have, interestingly, where her POV ends in Feast for Crows, we don't have her reaction to Littlefinger saying, I'm going to marry you off and give you the world. So that, I guess it remains to be seen. But she's totally different to Cersei insofar as Cersei's undoing is her almost maniacal blind spot and love for her children. Well, we don't know what Sansa will be like yet in that respect. But Sansa certainly doesn't have her lack of self-control. Cersei thinks she's 150% more smart than she is. Sansa, I think, probably underestimates herself. But I think, objectively speaking, will end up being A, cleverer than Cersei, B, far more self-aware, and C, she just has much more empathy than Cersei, which will make her a better ruler. So there's an interesting scene in Storm of Swords where they go to the wedding and Tyrion's observing her kind of just moving around the court and saying a kind word to this knight and a kind word to that knight, and even making Lancel feel better about himself. And he says, you know what, she's really good at this and she would have made Joffrey an amazing queen. And I don't think Cersei ever had the mind to make the court love her. And even as far back as Blackwater, people are really harsh on Sansa when she's little. But as far back as Blackwater, when all the ladies are holed up in the keep, and there's a point at which Cersei just loses it and leaves, and Sansa gives a speech and says, "Look, ladies, this is the safest place for you. Calm down." She asserts herself as a leader, as a consort, which I think is very mature. So I think she's superior to Cersei in every respect.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I guess the concern is, will she lose that empathy, or at least that genuine empathy? She may still retain the ability to show it off, but will she lose that along the way of all that she's gone through and will go through in the future?
I really don't think so, and I think it as her trials increase, she becomes more empathetic. She's the least empathetic at the start of the novels, and it's really interesting that even people who've done her harm, like there's a lot of scenes where she says, you know, and she prays for this person, that person, and it's like, I must be weak because I'm even praying for Lancel, or even Sweet Robin. Like there'll be lines where even when she's like, my God, Dontos is such a fool, he's like throwing up without, you know, he's drunk so much as he's trying to rescue me. She'll always have a line like, but still, I feel sorry for him, my poor Jonquil. Or with Sweet Robin, you know, she always says, don't be so hard on him. It's not his fault. He's the sickly. So my one hope for Sansa is that she retains that empathy. And I think it's a really interesting contrast with Arya and, in a sense, Tyrion, actually, who are becoming more and more desensitized. I don't think it's happening to Sansa yet, and I hope it won't, because then it makes a very interesting, dramatic contrast.
I guess the one other thing I would ask is, do you think that Sansa is experiencing a crisis of identity on the level perhaps of even Arya, where with this Elaine Stone, and where she is constantly comparing herself to Elaine and how she can be more like Elaine? And like you say, she is having this issue fully recalling the kiss with Sandor. Do you think that that's just her misremembering things, or do you think that is a legitimate crisis of identity she's experiencing?
Oh, the unkiss. I mean, I don't know. I don't think her identity is as fractured as Arya's, and I don't think it's certainly not on the level of Theon Reek. I think she's much more in control of that creation. She's like an author. She's like George, creating a character and a back history and a way of being in that character. And it's just a coping mechanism. So Jaime goes away inside. She creates a braver person to become. And it's really smart. I think she knows exactly who she is. As for the unkiss, that's interesting. I think people kind of make a lot of it. I think it's just classic teenage, you know, sort of. That was a huge moment for her and a very traumatic night. And yeah, interesting to see where that goes. I'm not going to say more because I'm just going to embarrass her. Because I'm just so hoping that Sansa and Sandor somehow meet once again. After
Littlefinger tells her that the plot with Harold tarrying, he mentions that small folk have yet to recover from the War of the Five Kings, and then he mentions the War of the Three Queens. So I'm wondering, who do you think Littlefinger is thinking of when he says the Three Queens?
Well, Tim, I assume that was Marjorie, Cersei, Dany?
It feels like to me that everyone doesn't credit Daenerys enough. And despite the fact that they know about her, I don't know if they credit her as a threat. So I don't think Littlefinger pays enough attention to her. So I think that when he says the Three Queens, he is talking about Marjorie, Cersei, and Sansa.
Though he could be talking about the Queen of Thorns or even other people, I don't know. But yeah, I don't think he's thinking about Daenerys at all. I think that Daenerys and that whole issue is very much on the side of the Varys, Doran Martell camp. I feel like he's just not giving her a second thought, which could come back to bite him in the future.
Yeah, it'd be very interesting if it is Sansa, though. Because my theory has always been that the Maggie the Frog prophecy, that the beautiful queen who will depose her, I always assume it's going to be Sansa for whatever stupid reason. Or maybe he thinks it's Myrcella. Is the whole Dornish plot, maybe he thinks that Dorne's going to rise up for Myrcella at that point?
Yeah, it's hard to say. As for the beautiful queen thing, I think you have a point. I think it's a little bit too easy to say it's Marjorie. I think that George would not go for something so basic. I think that he loves his twists, and he will not just let us have that simple Marjorie deposes Cersei and the Tyrells gain power like it seems like it might be going. So yeah, you have a good point there, I think.
Yeah, I'd love it to be Sansa. I'd love Sansa to become a major player. That would just make me very happy.
When Griffin lands on Westeros and his maester Holden was going over the correspondence, he does refer the the two queens are fighting over Tom and like two bitches over something, two bitches over a mutton of meat or something like that. So I think of the three queens, Marjorie and Cersei are definitely two of them. But yeah, it's interesting who the third one is. It can't be Marcella because I think now that Griffin has shown up, I think the Dornish are definitely going to throw their army behind him, and not set up Marjorie as the queen.
Does Peter know that Griff's landed at that point?
Yeah, I don't think so. Not yet. I
No,
don't
it's
think he
just-
had landed when he said that. But I don't know the
Right. We
full
don't see
timeline.
Sansa in book number 5. So this happened towards the end of book number 5. So it's after the timeline. I was going to say, without the Targaryens, the chance of a unified Seven Kingdoms is pretty much impossible. I think the Seven Kingdoms have been broken since Robert's rebellion. I mean, the Dornish were never really part of him. They never attended his court or anything because of Lyanna's murder thing. And yeah, I don't think Peter Baelish is trying to make Sansa the queen of the Seven Kingdoms. I think he's just trying to carve out the biggest chunk of kingdoms possible for himself and her. But now with Griffin landing, it changes everything.
And you have to wonder if any of this is going to matter in the end. If we're going to just see all these squabbling things happening, and these players that are fighting each other for control, and how much import we're putting on that. But what if it just all doesn't matter? The White Walkers, of course, are a very real threat, and they could be coming down the wall soon. So that's something to
That's
think
true.
about.
But
You know what I want to happen? I want as soon as Peter hears of Griffin landing, he takes a boat over there, and instead of giving Sansa to Harold Harding, he gives it to young Griffin.
Oh my God, yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's the
Do you
kind
think-
of a twist that Martin likes to throw, right? It likes to
Do you think
throw in.
Varys might block that, though? I think that he would probably have something to say about that. And I think he's deeply involved in what Griffin is doing.
But why wouldn't
Yeah, he wants
Varys
it to
want that,
marry.
though?
Well,
I think they want him to marry Dany, right?
But I don't get the point of that, because if Griff's already a Targ, isn't it more unifying and wise to marry her to a Stark?
Or Arianne, right?
Yeah, like to get another king. I think that's kind of politically wasteful.
Is
Yeah,
Arianne
potentially.
Martell older than Griffin, young Griffin?
I think older. I think
she's
he's
much
like
older,
16 or
right?
17. We don't get an exact age, but I think Ariane is much older. Like she's early 20s, I think.
Right. She was Viserys' age at least.
Not that will stop.
Yeah, I think that could potentially be one of the things that we see Varys being a little bit short-sighted. We haven't really seen him make any mistakes so far, but it seems like he's putting a lot of import on having a lot of Targaryen control potentially. We don't know for sure yet, but he is definitely picking off major players that he might have been able to turn to his side. Previously, he's killed off Tywin. He's now killed off Kevin. Could Varys just not want any of the other houses having any slice of the pie in the future? That's kind of the sense I get.
But I think the difference between, who's the more clever, Varys or Littlefinger, is a really interesting discussion, because Varys we've seen kind of do a lot of destruction and cause a lot of chaos, but we've not yet seen him do a long, thought-out plan that's really, truly come to fruition in the way that with Peter, we've seen him doing lots of stuff in kind of pre-Game of Thrones in terms of manipulating lists and getting Master of Coin, amassing a fortune, manipulating everything in Game of Thrones. Even stuff as small as, getting the fighting dwarfs on pigs at the purple wedding. And then, you see how his plans have come to fruition. And although he's still at a quite precarious point, you can see where his plans could go. I don't think we yet have as clear a picture on what Varys is really ultimately up to. Whereas by the end of Feast, we kind of know in a way Peter's long game. I think, I'm not.
Yeah, I think that.
I'm not as convinced. Put it this way: I'm not as convinced that Varys is such a clever master schemer. He's great at doing all sorts of crazy shit that has big impact, but I'm yet to be convinced that he will succeed in his long game.
Yeah, that's
Well, if
interesting, 'cause I think-
Dany did,
Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I was going to say, if Dany did everything as they expected, I mean, the plan was Dany would marry Khal Drogo and get the army for Viserys, and then Viserys would marry Arianne Martell, and the Dornish would bring in their 50,000 lot. But, unfortunately, Viserys got killed, and Dany went to Karth, and then instead of returning with Belwas and Barristan, she went to Slaver's Bay. So I don't think it's Varys' fault that his plans are all fumbling. I think it's Dany's, you know.
So he's just, yeah. I mean, I have a lot of sympathy with that, Vikram, that basically Varys looks less organized than he really is just because Dany's
Right.
kind of her own.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Right, Varys' big piece is Dany, and Dany is the most unpredictable character of anyone. Yeah, if Varys' plans and Magister Illyrio's plans worked, I think the Dothraki and the Dornish would be already in the field right now.
What he does
With
have
the
is a lot of
Golden Cloaks,
contingency plans.
Gold Company, I mean.
Yeah, he seems to always have a contingency plan, which is, I think, his strength.
I agree. Can I ask a question that kind of arises from the Sansa chapters but isn't to do with Sansa, which is, what do you guys think really happened to Marillion? And is it that Sweet Robin really does hear Marillion, or is it that he's dead, or is it that maybe Peter's given him to Lynn Corbray as a man toy?
You know what I noticed? What's the musician's name that Arya kills? Daeron, the Night's Watch guy that Jon Snow sends out. I think Martin doesn't like musicians for some reason.
Well, the worst is the Blue Bard, who's currently, I think, being tortured by Qyburn. He's not in good shape.
So yeah, it's not a good thing to be a musician in this world.
Maybe once upon a time George R. R. Martin was dating like a musician who broke his heart and stamped on it. And now he's just
Have you guys seen this YouTube video of Martin breaking somebody's guitar at Comic-Con? So this is all comic thing, you know. There was a band playing Right Like the Wind, you know, directed towards Martin. And then Martin comes on the stage, takes the guy's guitar, breaks it, and then Neil Gaiman shows up and makes him say, "Martin is not your bitch."
That's brilliant. You totally have to put that video in the show.
Yeah, we'll put it in the show notes.
One theory that I've heard, that I've read on Westeros is that Littlefinger gives Robert Arryn to Lynn Corbray, and that makes Robert Arryn crazy, and that's why he hears Marilyn singing. He's just affected by the rape from Lynn Corbray.
Oh, okay. So it's not that he's given Marillion to Lynn Corbray. He's given Sweet Robin to Lynn Corbray.
I think he's too old for Lynn Corbray.
That's really mean. Wow.
I never thought of that.
That's just there's no real evidence for that, is there though?
No evidence, just if you can read between the lines. Let's see. So there is this point when Littlefinger says that he just likes golden boys, but what boys does Littlefinger have at his disposal?
Well, that's why I thought Marillion, so I put Marillion in the boys category. I didn't realise the guy was a paedophile. Wow, okay. We'll see, I guess. We'll see the Winds of Winter. Have we said all that we need to say about Sansa? You're all on board? You're all Sansa shippers now?
Yeah, I want to see what Sansa does. I think that, like you say, she's probably definitely a victor in the future, or potentially a player at the very least, and I really look forward to seeing her next steps in this game.
I certainly missed her from A Dance with Dragons.
Yeah. So, yeah, my concluding line on Sansa is, I don't think she's necessarily proved herself to be a total player yet, but I think she's perhaps the one player who I think's got the highest rate of ascent. And I think one of the most interesting ones to see what they do in the next book, because I think she's going to become really kick-ass.